FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome, and you are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz. It's April 2nd, 2018. Well, you think the cops are your friends, or do you think they're your enemy? Well, if you read publications like the New York Times, like the Washington Compost, you would think that they're out to get you, especially if you happen to be black or a minority. But the truth is the truth. They can't hide it. And Ron Hosko, you are president of Law Enforcement Action Network, former assistant director of the FBI. And hey, we're thrilled to have you here. As always, be part of the show. Email us, kl@kerrylutz.com. Ron, welcome. And I know you got a lot to say on this subject. We're really happy to have you on.
It is good to be with you. I do have some things to say on the subject of the anti-cop narrative that we've heard kind of circling America for, well, I guess about four plus years now, or coming up on 4 years since the days of Ferguson.
Well, Michael Brown was a gentle giant. He never would hurt a fly, right? What did I miss? Isn't that what happened?
We found out that's not quite accurate. We saw, if you were paying attention, evidence of and read evidence of Michael Brown, I think, 6'4", maybe 290 pounds, attacking not just a storekeeper or a shopkeeper in Ferguson, but shortly thereafter, when he was being chased off the street and onto the sidewalk, he decided to attack a uniformed patrol officer sitting in a marked police vehicle, and thus began the fatal encounter of Ferguson that gave rise to the Hands Up, Don't Shoot movement, protests across the country, lies across the country, very troubling times for America.
Yeah, well, I agree that he was no harmless little guy who just was trying to smoke a cigar and be left alone. You know, probably if the officer had it to do all over again, he would have done things differently, like moved his car in a place where he could take cover and pull out his gun immediately and arrest the two. But unfortunately, you don't get to go back in time for these things. There's no question that the narrative of the mainstream media, particularly the Times, Washington Post, the LA Times, you name it, CNN, is always to portray the officer at fault when there's a shooting involved. And just like if you're Al Franken, you know, their object is to get prejudgment and pretrial penalization of whatever it is you're alleged to have done, rather than waiting for the fact finders to actually establish what happened and who was at fault. I mean, this is really an alarming trend that goes against the rule of law and is really injurious to the social fabric of America.
Well, Kerry, having served for almost 30 years in the FBI, some of that time I served as an inspector. We hope that the FBI is one of those fact-based organizations. I know they're taking their share of criticism recently, but my experience there was the facts should drive the investigation. And in my time as an inspector in the FBI, I did several fatal shooting investigations. And I know that the facts can change, the evidence can change. Witnesses have different views of an event. Some of them may be very vividly recalled. Some of them may struggle with their recollection, but it's the composite, it's the collective facts. Very often the forensics support your findings. And you talked about it. There's a purpose for having a detailed, thorough, unbiased investigation. It's what I think I used to do with my colleagues, but we saw evidence, certainly after 2009, we saw evidence not just of the misguided, ill-informed commentary of pundits. We saw it coming from the President of the United States as well. I go back to his comments after an encounter between between one of his friends, which is a classic area of bias. You have a dog in the fight. That's one of your friends. His friend was Henry Gates up at Harvard University. Right. He had an encounter with the police in Cambridge, and before the president knew anything, he came out with a comment that the police had acted stupidly.
Boneheaded, as he called.
Go ahead.
He called them boneheaded. And this guy was climbing in the window of his house in the evening. Now, of course, a cop goes by. You don't know that this guy couldn't find his key and is legitimately gaining entry to his home. And of course you're going to stop him, because imagine if the cop didn't stop the guy and he proceeded to rob Gates's house. If he was a robber, a burglar, if you will. Robber, it's not robbery, it's burglary. Can you imagine the grief that he would have gotten had he not taken any action against the guy climbing through the window? I mean, it's absurd. That was that Gates thing that resulted in the so-called beer summit at the White House. Right.
That's exactly right. So we went through a period of time where we had a president who was willing to offer his own armchair quarterbacking without waiting for the facts to be known. Same president who decided to send, I think, 3 White House representatives to the funeral of Michael Brown, who turns out engaged in a violent, felonious attack on a uniformed police officer, Darren Wilson, who later made the decision to use deadly force in defending his own life against the charging Michael Brown. We saw time and again a president who wanted to put his thumb on the scale. And then, you expand that out to other public personalities, whether it's the LA Rams coming on to, I think they were then the St. Louis Rams, coming onto the football field in their hands up, don't shoot poses, to a group of commentators on CNN, to people, to U.S. Congress persons in the House of Representatives, assuming the hands up, don't shoot pose that was later proven fallacious. It was the myth of Ferguson that Michael Brown had his hands up, and now we have this series of public persons. And now you made reference to some commentary that I had in the Daily Caller, where a Washington Post writer in an article questioning, entitled "Police Are Still Killing Black People. Why Don't We Notice?" And what does he do in his article? He invokes the names of Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, and Freddie Gray. All of those, as I said in my piece, are really dog whistles. Trayvon Martin, his life was not taken by the police. It was his life. It was lost in an encounter with a private citizen, a neighborhood watchman named George Zimmerman. Yeah. It wasn't a police event at all.
Nothing to do with the cops.
Right. Sandra Bland, took her own life in a police detention cell after a street stop that was videotaped, but she took her own life. And Freddie Gray, the best evidence that I heard was that Freddie Gray essentially thrashed himself almost to death in the back of a police van.
Exactly. I mean, this is pure silliness when you get down to it. It's lies. It's propaganda of the worst order. And it's deception. Like the other thing, Trayvon Martin, just like the shooter at Parkland, was a product of Project Promise, which was a program that was created by Obama and Holder to narrow the disparity of expulsions and suspensions of minority students, particularly African Americans and whites, because the blacks are much higher than the whites, and they wanted to see that disparity decreased, not caring about the safety of the children involved. And as a result, this Project Promise let all sorts of criminal behavior take place, for which Cruz, the gunman in Parkland, was never sanctioned, never charged anything. And what happened? Shock. He turned into a monster, and they helped aid and abet it, but nobody's talking about that.
No, there have been some writers who I think have really put the appropriate light on that policy. It may be a policy designed for a positive purpose, but sometimes these policies run off the rails. And that policy, I think, we showed the holes in that policy when you come up with, as you say, a monster, Nicholas Cruz, who was a ticking bomb. He was flashing red in front of anybody who looked in his general direction. This was a kid who was absolutely running off the rails. He was moving toward violence. It seemed like it was painfully predictable. Did the system fail? Absolutely, the system failed. What was the system? The system was designed to keep Nicholas Cruz on the street, away from treatment, certainly out of police handcuffs. They succeeded in that because after dozens of police contacts, this guy was still acquiring the weapons and the ammunition to do his deadly bidding at some point in the future, and it was imminently predictable.
Yeah, completely. So, and of course, I didn't see an article about Project Promise in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, in the LA Times, in the Chicago Tribune. Why do you think that is?
Well, that and the truth about some of these narratives, like the narrative of Wesley Lowery in the Washington Post, the truth undermines what they're trying to move us toward.
Yeah.
And it is unfortunate. And unfortunately, part of what they're trying to move us toward is distrust in law enforcement, distrust of the police, the very people who might intervene and might derail some of these plots. What Wesley Lowery and others are trying to do is damage our trust in our law enforcement.
Hey, and look, there's plenty of reasons to point fingers at law enforcement. There's been problems in the past. No one can deny that. You can't deny it. But the fact is, until they come up with a better thing or a more effective way than using police, I don't really see any choice but that we have to work and make our police forces, state, local, federal, as honest and as effective and as just as possible. I mean, how else are we going to do this? Are we going to devolve into hiring private security, Pinkertons, mob rule? What is our choice here, realistically?
Well, I agree with you, and I think our realistic choice is invest in the law enforcement that we have. It is to make them as transparent as possible. There's a logic to that. There's a reason for it. We expect much of police. We give the police great authority in America. To me, the question is, are we investing in them effectively? We should raise the bar with police. We should demand much of police chiefs, certainly accountability and transparency. As you say, there's no doubt that law enforcement from time to time makes mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are fatal. The question to me is, have we invested properly in them? Have we trained them effectively? Have we hired the right leaders and expected those leaders to instill the right culture? Have we given them the tools? Have we hired the right people at every level? Certainly at the starting, at the lowest ranks in policing, have we hired the right people who are putting their hands up for the right reasons, training them effectively, equipping them properly, and then holding them to account? If we've not done those things, we should expect the police to fail us. We should expect it.
Yeah, and it's funny how often it does boil down to training or lack of effective training. And, that's something that I know that when you're in police academy, it's not the real world. And then all of a sudden you come out and you're in shock because, this wasn't what we studied in school. But realistically, like you said, transparency, crucial, and openness, let people know what's going on. There often is that wall between the police and the community. But when you have your elected officials declaring war on the police, like Bill de Blasio in New York, Comrade Bill, and others around the country, it just makes the police task so much more difficult. Look what's happened with the crime rate in all of these cities since the war on police started. It's Ron, it's really quite distressing. The murder rates in Chicago, in Baltimore, in St. Louis, and in many other cities just gone off the charts.
Well, that's right. We saw violent crime in successive years. After 20 years of decline, I think over 20 years of decline, we saw violent crime rates and homicide rates jump in America. Really, in the wake of Ferguson in 2015 and 2016, we saw violent crime and homicide jump in a lot of places by double digits. In some places, as you say, not just Ferguson, not just St. Louis, but Chicago. A massive jump in the homicide numbers up there. And we're talking about that cost the lives of hundreds of people. And what do we get? We have protests forming up, hollering, hands up, don't shoot, in a lot of places in the country. Again, a false narrative. Where's Black Lives Matter in the streets of Chicago when hundreds of people, most of them black in Chicago, have lost their lives to black versus black violent crime? Where is Black Lives Matter in that city? Where are they in Baltimore, where you're really talking about in economically depressed, educationally challenged areas of the city? Where is Black Lives Matter? They're ready to help the city burn in the wake of Freddie Gray when you're talking about the police involved, but when it's black on black crime, Black Lives Matter is missing in action. We've not heard anything from them in Chicago, nothing from them in the city of Baltimore, where the violent crime has gone up horrifically in the last few years. Where are they then?
Good question.
No advantage to them unless it's anti-cop.
That seems to be the case, doesn't it? Really distressing. Hey, I know that you're going to want to find out more about what Ron does and about the Law Enforcement Action Network. Ron, where's the best place for people to learn more?
They can find us online at leaction.org. We stand for a lot of different purposes, including the rule of law and, of course, support to our men and women in law enforcement, bringing reason to this notion of sanctuary cities in America, and the notion that federal authorities shouldn't be allowed to go into the jails and find out who's there, instead be chased out to the streets to try to track down criminal illegals. We stand for justice in America, and they can find us at leaction.org, Law Enforcement Action Network, and on the other side, Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, where we raise funds to help defend wrongly accused law enforcement officers who have to unfortunately face trial for doing what their training has told them to do on the streets of America.
Very sad. Hey, we could spend a segment just talking about criminal illegal aliens. I love what the Orange County, California sheriff is doing, posting the times that illegal aliens are going to be released from jail so that ICE can be there and pick them up and get them the hell out of here, which is what we need. Anyway, Ron, really appreciate you coming on. Hey, for more information, be part of the show. Email us kl@kerrylutz.com. The Twitter feed's @KerryLutz. The Facebook page is Financial Survival Network. Ron, wish you the best of luck in your mission. We're with you 100%.
Thanks, Kerry. Great talking to you today.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.